Thank you, Shauna. Wonderful presentation. For those of you who are fans of the obscure sci-fi film, to me, Dr. Shauna Pandya is the female Buckaroo Banzai. And for those of you who don't get it, you should definitely look it up. All right, Cyan, back to you. We've done history of space, we've done Apollo, we've done space medicine, we've covered a wide variety of topics, past, present, and future. What about business? What about the business opportunities in space?
Well, one of the most exciting business opportunities that I've seen personally emerge, of course, I'm going to talk about analog astronauts. Most of you, I would guess that all of you never even heard that term 10 years ago. Why? Because it didn't exist. But yet now there are analogs all over the world and people are paying money to go and become flight ready. I mean, with commercial space opening up and the whole idea of if you're a small nation like Poland, for example, and you want to get people excited about space, well, how do you do that when you can't have a budget for sending people up into space? An easy way is by building a habitat and having analog astronauts go and live so you can contribute to human space flight training and research for a little bit of money and infrastructure. I just talked to somebody in Brazil that has a habitat that they created. And so what's really interesting is this idea of the economy or the business of space and people who are excited about it wanting to be ready in case the opportunity comes. I know that if somebody is like, hey, Cyan, I want to send you to the moon or even low Earth orbit on one of the suborbital flights, send me. I want to be flight ready. And I'm willing to pay to become flight ready so that when the opportunity happens, I'm there. Well, I got to ask you about this here, Jeff, because you dropped this paperweight. Oh my goodness.
Where did this mysterious thing arrive from? It was almost as if it fell out of the sky.
It did.
Cyan, in my opinion, what you are looking at there is in large part the future of the business side of long-term space exploration and development. It is a meteorite. And meteorites, in large part, come to us from asteroids. So years ago, when I was invited to join the advisory board of Deep Space Industries, the asteroid mining company, it was because of my expertise in meteorites. Mm-hmm. And the reasoning is this. If we understand what meteorites are and what they're made of, we begin to understand what the asteroids that they come from might be made of. And so if we want to harvest valuable raw materials from asteroids, a really good place to start your research is meteorites. Now, this definitely came from an asteroid. This was once part of the molten core of an enormous asteroid that probably lived somewhere in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. It, like most things in the solar system, is billions of years old. It is believed to have landed on Earth between 4,500 and 5,000 years ago.
But how do we take this and what we can learn from it and turn it into a viable business? And, when we're talking about space.
Robots.
Robots. I love that. Right.
I knew you were going to like that. Okay, so here's a theoretical model. We study meteorites. We begin to understand the makeup of asteroids in the solar system, of which there are millions. And then we send robot ships to select asteroids that are very good candidates for mining. And once we have figured out how to extract the raw materials that we need in space, instead of blasting everything that we need into orbit, the entire future of space development is changed permanently. And even with the lower costs that we're now seeing for payloads, thanks to the innovation of SpaceX, it's still not going to work for us very long term to take everything that we need, all the spacesuits, all the food, all the water and air and everything else, the fuel, into space. It's just not going to work if we're going to establish a very large, meaningful long-term presence. So asteroid mining could be a big part of the answer.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying basically is that we have to figure this out if we are going to have a permanent presence, humanity, a permanent presence on the moon and Mars and beyond. I mean, we really don't have a choice. We've got to figure out how to use the resources out there. And what I like about that is it helps solve for the resources here and us managing what's happening here on Earth.
Wouldn't it be great if all astronauts that leave Earth for permanent habitation elsewhere rapidly become self-sufficient and don't have to rely on taking resources from Earth to help sustain them? And this is part of the answer. This is an iron meteorite. This is nickel and iron and trace elements. But I don't want you to just think heavy metals when you're thinking asteroid mining. The type of asteroid that the OSIRIS-REx mission is investigating, the asteroid Bennu, is likely the type of asteroid from which carbonaceous chondrite meteorites come from. And we have discovered that that type of meteorite often contains water, carbon, amino acids. So that means we can also theoretically extract water, oxygen, other necessary materials that we need from life from these asteroids that are just sitting out there in the cold, waiting to help us. They're free resources once we figure out how to get there and how to extract them. And here to talk to us about new business opportunities in the world of spaceflight is SpaceX board member, venture capitalist, and spaceflight entrepreneur, Steve Jurvetson.
Well, thank you to the National Space Society for putting on such a fantastic day of speakers. I'm finishing up a line that starts with incredible Apollo astronauts and business leaders and space practitioners. And I can't tell you how honored I am to be part of this ceremony today. I'm going to be sharing some of the ideas of a new day in new space, the business aspects of what we've been seeing and where we see the space industry going. I work at a venture firm called Future Ventures, and I'm on the board of SpaceX. I also led the early rounds of investment in Planet Labs and have been a space enthusiast for many years. In fact, I thought no better place to record this than in our offices here at Future Ventures. We are surrounded by Apollo-era space artifacts like this full couch, with translation control assemblies and joysticks from the Apollo era, artifacts from the Russian and Apollo space program, contemporary elements. So there's a piece of every lunar module that's been to the moon, et cetera. So you can tell I'm a real space nut at my core. I've in fact turned the entire office into a space museum. So you might ask, well, how did I get here? How did this come to be? And let me just share a couple of things for context. One is I was a geek from early on. I grew up in Texas and went to Johnson Space Center for Space Camp, the obligatory embarrassing photos of my youth. But I've also strangely been launching amateur rockets for 17 years now with my son, supersonic big things out in the desert. This is actually an O motor, something that's used as a cruise missile booster that we flew most recently. And I've also been an evangelist for rocketry, both as a hobby and as an investment thesis. The only time I've ever been in Harvard Business Review on a business topic was about rocketry, as you can see here, and I've been passionate about it for some time. But I've also done venture capital now for 25 years. And in the first 14 of those years, not a single space-related investment passed muster in my judgment, meaning not one of those proposals was credible enough that I thought I should bring them in for a pitch meeting to my partners. And that's usually how this happens in a venture firm. You get excited about something, you spend some time evaluating an investment opportunity, and ultimately you have to get it through your partnership. So 14 years, not one. I saw all kinds of proposals for fuel depots, for asteroid mining, for you name it. But there were some problems with every one of these proposals. The cost of launch was very high, so it became a capital-intensive business. The customer sets in many cases were government or government programs, which are unpredictable before they happen. And perhaps most insidious of all, for many of the entrepreneurs out there, they didn't know what their launch costs would actually be. They knew they would be high, but they were negotiations that took place in smoky, dark rooms. And frankly, there was a lot of opacity. Unless you were an industry insider, you really didn't know what launch costs. So it's very hard to put together a business proposal. Now, everything changed because you might imagine this is a setup for SpaceX. SpaceX was our first space investment. And when we first invested, they had been trying to get the Falcon 1 to be a successful launch. They had not yet booked any successful satellite launches with the Falcon 1. The first three were failures on the path to success. And we saw everything changing. So we invested in that. I joined the board. And it's like night and day. Obviously, the lowering cost of launch, not just by SpaceX, but its competitors having to follow suit. The sense of hopefulness in the engineering ranks and young people everywhere realizing that it's not sort of like it used to be. In fact, and we'll make more about this points about this later, that the business case for space is a lot more exciting than the government case for space. Now, it's not to say the government isn't the major customer, but when something like launch can be provided by a business for the government customer, that's a much healthier place to be than fixed price, cost plus contracts, where you, in the old ways of doing things, where you're basically beholden to a singular customer, the government. So this free market, this large NASA customer in hand, and frankly, a business that was profitable and had about $10 billion of backlog in those early days, caught the attention of the venture community as well. So fast forward to today, you've had an enormous influx of investment in the space sector. In fact, in 2015, when SpaceX first raised $1 billion and Planet Labs raised about $100 million, that combined was more than the entire venture industry had invested in the space sector throughout history combined times 2. And that was 2015. It's gone up from there. And you now have over 500 venture funds who have invested in space. 500, right? When I first invested in SpaceX, there were like a handful, less than 5. It's been a pretty dramatic change. And in fact, in some sectors like small sat launch vehicles, now 145 different venture-backed startups all going after the same prize, a smaller, lower-cost launch vehicle for small satellites. It's unlike anything I've ever seen before. So now you might ask yourself, what changed? What allowed SpaceX to do what it has done and is continuing to do? The same question could be asked of Tesla and a number of companies that have radically changed large industries that haven't faced new entrants in decades, in some cases 100 years, and who are left a little bit flat-footed when a new entrant does come with new system engineering, new software stack, and a radically new approach to the problem that really is what disruptive innovation is all about. And that's what we invest in. That's what we look for in our startups that we invest in. So SpaceX, I think, is iconic of this. I'll just mention it's nearly identical in the case of Tesla. And in both cases, it's really all about system engineering and software. System engineering in the sense that it's not a patented thing, right? It's not like a single transistor or circuit or thing that you would frankly patent that makes the difference. In fact, Tesla has open sourced patents and SpaceX famously has none. It rather is the way you can integrate off-the-shelf components, minimize the physical thing, and push all the value to the software and services layer. So let's talk about that in some depth. And let me start with the most important framework for thinking about that. And that is what I call the 120-year version of Moore's Law. Hopefully you can see a detailed version of this, but to explain it for those who haven't seen it before, this is my favorite abstraction of Moore's Law because actually no one quotes Gordon Moore himself and what he wrote in his original paper accurately. They go with what they mean by that. Computers are getting faster, better, cheaper. You're getting roughly a doubling performance each year. And here what you're graphing is the amount of computing power you can get for a constant dollar. So, inflation of the dollar is already factored into this. And it is a logarithmic scale. So every tick you see going up the y-axis is 100x, another 100x, another 100x. So it's not 10, 10, 20, 30. It's 10, and then 1,000 and so forth. 100,000 and so on. So a straight line on a graph like this is an exponential. And you have years along the bottom, over 120 years. So most importantly, realize the integrated circuit, Moore's Law, Intel, everything you've heard from them really only describes the most current epoch of something that's actually going on for longer than people knew to measure it and is fundamentally, philosophically very profound. How is it that humanity's capacity to compute has compounded over 120 years and will likely continue to do so for the next 10 or 20, even if Intel's not leading the charge? Right? The last 10 years on this graph, by the way, are led by NVIDIA and the GPUs that are used in deep learning and machine learning, and now custom ASICs and such that are increasingly gathering the new compute cycles in the data center and in devices at the edge. So let's pause for a moment. Realize the economy, Great Depression, World War I, World War II have had no impact on this curve. This curve just continues unabated. It is, I think, the driver of progress. It is a driver of technological change. And from a technology business point of view, it's the single most important thing ever graphed. And I'll repeat that. I believe this is the single most important graph, probably of any kind, in existence today, in that it drives decision-making in profound and important ways. It has held true for longer than most things you could dare to plot in either technology or business. And it really is increasingly driving the economy. I believe every industry in the long run becomes an information business, meaning they compete on how they process information, not how they convert raw materials, right? So you dematerialize the thing, you move value to the software layer, much like our body becomes less important and it's more about our brains as a human species versus earlier animals. So let's keep that in mind and realize it's likely to continue. And when it does, things that were formerly a trial and error science become a simulation science. Things that required a wind tunnel, right? Like airplanes before the Boeing 777, or wet lab chemistry to test if something works. You can actually simulate more and more and more in a computer and rapidly advance the pace of progress. That's the underlying driver of these industry transitions. You take a formerly industrial, crappy, frankly, low gross margin, uninteresting business, and you turn it into an exciting, dynamic software services business. So where have we seen that over the last 10 years or so? Where we've invested in robotics and AI, of course, but ones that wouldn't have been so obvious 20 years ago: automotive, aerospace, synthetic biology, and food manufacturing itself. And soon, some of our new investments might be in the area of construction. The construction industry hasn't seen much change also for decades, if not centuries, in terms of fundamental change of how we go about architecting from a drawing to a building. But space has been a great example, and we'll focus, of course, entirely on that in today's talk. So let's talk about SpaceX and simulation. It, at times, is hard to tell what's reality in this world as simulation that we live in. It's kind of, every time I see Starman in a Tesla out in orbit, out near close to Mars orbit, is mind-boggling to me. And of course, that's real. And how is it that SpaceX has managed to pull these things off, often working for the first time? First Falcon 9 launch, a success. The first Falcon Heavy launch, total success. I would argue the first booster return is success. We'll get back to that. It had to do with precision, but the idea that you could flip it around, fly it back, and have it come to a controlled stop, in the first case over the open ocean, was shown the very first time. How do you possibly make that happen when in prior efforts it took scores of failures to have a success? And I think the main driver, or a major driver of that, of course, you have good engineers, smart people solving problems. That's important. But it's also important to simulate hundreds, thousands, millions of times things that you might run into before you do. So on the left, you can see a photo I took several years ago in the back bowels of SpaceX of what they call the Iron Maiden. Basically, a big table with all the avionics structures laid out. So the entire rocket, in a sense, is virtually there on the table. And you can test things like the Dragon spacecraft against all kinds of perturbations. What happens if this goes out, if a thruster goes out? All the things that in the Apollo program, you ran physical simulations with humans, and only a handful of them in many cases. At Hope, you simulated all the situations you needed to cover. In this case, you actually can give amazing coverage and, again, make things work the first time. On the right side, you see an image from a video that was shown of basically a CFD tool, a custom wavelet tool that SpaceX developed from scratch. So sometimes when you want to do good simulation work, you don't even find that off-the-shelf tools can do the job that you need with the precision that you need for, in this case, combustion dynamics. And if you think back to, let's say, the F1 engine in the Saturn V days, you had this problem of pogoing or combustion instability that required all kinds of physical experiments and ultimately a feedback loop to try to quench the problem. But all kinds of different injector plate designs were tried to solve the problem. Here, you can simulate things such that the engines tend to work much sooner than they otherwise would. Okay. Of course, the biggest area of simulation was, can you do something that never been tried before, that had been long thought should be done, but everyone in the industry who was SpaceX competitor thought couldn't be done, or couldn't be done effectively, or couldn't be done economically. They keep changing their story, but it has been done. And as I pointed out, the very first time over the open ocean, because of the telemetry on board, we know that it came to a complete and controlled stop, hovering, and nothing to land on. There was no, autonomous barge or anything at the time, and so it fell in the ocean and fell over. Amazingly, even with claims that success was made, I just didn't share something that was not public information. It's like nobody believed it. The competitors were like, no. But the engineers at SpaceX knew it. They knew that it works, that it will work. It is an inevitability that this is going to be workable if you can actually get the booster back in one piece that far and have it hovering over the ocean. The rest is becoming one precision of the avionics feedback loops and getting a precise landing on the autonomous drone ship. And then eventually, as you see here, with the Falcon Heavy, which I was there for that first launch, is unbelievable. It makes the world seem like a simulation when those two side boosters came back in synchrony. As many space fans know, that's probably one of my favorite images of all from the space program. Let me switch to where that came from. I was out there in Texas when the F9R blew up. That was astounding. And the days of vertical takeoff and landing tests here, the Grasshopper test vehicle that you can see, were really ones where people faced a lot of doubt. And I love this quote from Sir Arthur Clarke. I'll actually read it to you, so you don't have to scan along as I'm doing it. He says, escaping from Earth will not always be astronomically expensive. This will come through reusable boosters, which can be flown for hundreds of missions like normal aircraft. We will have to get away as quickly as possible from rocket launchers, which are discarded after a single flight. Now pause for a moment. I was reading this in a 2007 book called Spaceship One. And he wrote the foreword to this book. This was before SpaceX had any launch successes, by the way, with Falcon 9, or any reusable proof. And I thought, I stopped as I was reading. I was like, that sounds exactly like Elon Musk. Like, my gosh, this is the dream. This is exactly what SpaceX is trying to do, and everyone else says can't be done. How did Arthur Clarke come up with that just around the same time we were coming up with that and talking about that publicly? I found that kind of unusual. And then I read the very next line from Arthur Clarke in this foreword. He said, when I wrote these words in July 1969, Apollo 11 was on its way to the moon. So he knew, and certain forward-looking thinkers knew, this is the key to unlocking space exploration. The next phase, what logically would come after we land on the moon, would be habitating habitats in space, exploring Mars, going farther, not retrenching for decades. And to do that, you have to have reusable boosters. It's like you're not going to get there economically otherwise. The analogy being, if you threw away an airplane after every one-way flight, only governments and strange billionaires would fly. And that's what the aerospace industry looked like prior to SpaceX and reusability in particular. Now, what is the effect of this? No surprise, these aren't the latest data, but this was tabulated by the FAA a couple of years ago. And as all of you know, the list price for SpaceX, not the cost, but the list price is dramatically lower than global competitors. And it's going to be dropping further still. We'll get back to that in a moment. But keep this in mind, less than $10,000 a kilogram at the GTO. Well, what's the effect of that? It's hard to read the color, and it's on purpose. The only point I want to draw from this slide is the dark blue bottom bar and band, which is the United States market share of commercial launch. Now, the reason commercial launch is so relevant is this is where customers have a choice. They're not beholden to launch with only their domestic provider. Let's say if you're in Russia, you're going to launch on a Russian vehicle. If you're launching a Russian military satellite, you're not going to ship it over to the United States, and so on. So it's really the commercial market. And we had in the United States 100% market share in 1980. That dropped to 0 3 years in a row prior to SpaceX's reentry and rejuvenation of the U.S. comeback, and then took it back up to 2/3 and growing on market share. This again is, remember, when we had 0%, that wasn't because there weren't U.S. customers. There were plenty of U.S. customers flying commercial satellites for cable television and a bunch of transponders for telecom. And none of them there was nothing the U.S. had to offer that was competitive. Now, in the not too distant future, as many of you know, Starship should lower this another 100-fold. Based on the forecast that Elon has put out, we're talking getting down in the order of $10, not $10,000, but $10 a kilogram to low Earth orbit, maybe 10 times that to Mars, the surface of Mars. So now, the earlier comparison was a GTO. This is a dramatic change still. Like, if people thought this has been an industry that's gone through profound change, imagine how profound that will be to have another 10 or 100x further cost reduction. This opens up entirely new markets and opportunities. Well, how is it that SpaceX did this, by the way? One of the answers is that they had a vision that's bold and audacious and unlike their competitors, and that is to colonize Mars, to basically create a multiplanetary species out of humanity. And that is breathtakingly audacious, right? Before the last few years, people kind of dismissed that, I think, within the industry, the competitors, that is. And now they realize that is why reusability was such an important thing. That's why SpaceX invested estimated $1 billion into making this capability possible. If you were one of the incumbents just launching government satellites for your bread and butter, why go through all that effort when your competitors aren't going through that effort? Like, life was comfortable and simple, right? But if you want to get back from Mars, you have to reuse the hardware. If you, by the way, want to get back from Mars, you also want to reuse the fuel that you can make on Mars. So the switch and the huge investment in methane engines was also driven by that desire to get to Mars. So to recap, having a bold vision of how the world should be or inevitably will be, and then chaining back to the present, I think is the secret about Tesla and SpaceX for how you can make meaningful change today, iterating with customers today, but with a prize and a goal that motivates your employees like nothing else. And I think is motivating engineers and folks throughout the space industry. So what are some of the downstream effects? Well, look at this. 5x increase in the number of satellites launched in the last 5 years since SpaceX entered the business. Now, this is not just SpaceX. There's rideshare programs. There's small sat launchers. Remember, 145 following quickly in SpaceX's footsteps, thinking that perhaps there's a niche for that. I'm not so bullish on that myself. About 2/3 of these were by Planet Labs, mostly in the area of remote sensing or Earth observation. It's been a phenomenal growth, 5x in 5 years. And if I had the graph going back, it wouldn't be so dramatic looking back in the back years. So that's been the sort of the first obvious beneficiary. If you lower the cost of access to space, you can have a proliferation of applications, if you will, in space. Everything from Earth observation, better GPS systems, better all kinds of imaging systems, frankly, better broadband data, as we'll soon be talking about. And that's analogous in a sense to the fiber build out. to the internet. That before, if internet access was expensive, you wouldn't have all these cloud services. Once you had fiber build out and access proliferating for the lucky ones, you have this proliferation of applications and services. Now, I'll give you one quick example. When I was launching rockets again with my son out in the desert, we met this group from NASA and Google, strangely, and doing this thing called PhoneSat. Some of you may be familiar with that. They actually did launch Alexander Graham Bell, showing that an off-the-shelf Google phone is perfectly fine as a satellite, as a way to sort of galvanize a new kind of thinking within various folks in the space community and NASA that says you don't have to use such expensive equipment. You can overcome reliability issues in some cases in the software stack, and you can dramatically lower the cost, like 10,000-fold. I'm not blurring that, 10,000-fold reduction in cost that can be made up for in volume and just ship more and more products. It was a classic garage startup when we first invested. I led the seed round and the Series A, both literally in a garage, which I love. And they've now gone through many engineering builds. There was a time when they were actually coming out with a new physical design of the hardware every 2 months, and of course the software stack more rapidly still. Now, some of you may know this, the scale difference is immense. We heard of the ISS and 2 of the Planet Labs satellites coming out in the early days. And what they basically realized is by dramatically lowering the cost and complexity and flying closer to Earth, a smaller telescope can see just as well as a big, expensive one far away. As any photographer knows, you can do a lot better if you're closer to your subject, and the optics weight and cost goes way down. The reason people hadn't done that is that these satellites will deorbit too quickly, and if they're presumed to be expensive, and if launch is presumed to be expensive, you would never think about just launching new ones every few years. And Planet Labs has taken that to the extreme of almost disposable satellites. Just put up a new batch every year or two. But if they're 10,000x cheaper, it's still a much better proposition all around. And you get side benefits, of course, which is you're raster scanning the Earth every day. They've now imaged the entire Earth 1,000 times over. Every meter of the Earth is being imaged every day. And you don't have to task the satellite or tilt it. You're always pointing straight down. You can sell your imagery after the fact. You don't have to know ahead of time with the sales team where you're going to point your birds. You just take everything. And you get this incredible picture. I don't know if you can see this, but basically the amount of imagery is going up and up and up as they launch more satellites. And you can do things that weren't possible before. Like if you're imaging the same place every single day, you can discover refugee camps and other changes to Earth. You'll have a before and after any crisis zone, like when Fukushima happened, the only imagery just before was by Planet Labs. You also get these incredible images. The optics, or in this case from the SkySats, are incredible when you're off nadir, meaning you do tilt them at an angle. You can also take videos. It makes the world look like a simulation. In this case, in Qatar, it's just kind of mind-boggling. That's a real image. That's not doctored up. And you can do something else. When you sample the whole Earth every day, the problem shifts from one of agents and humans tasking satellites and saying, hey, let's look at this, let's have eyes on that. It offers you the opportunity to use machine learning to do discovery. So instead of saying, let's say by analogy, I'm going to read interesting web pages in the news of the day, you could use a search engine. You could look for things like train an algorithm on fracking oil well development or new housing starts, or what a ship looks like when it's doing illegal fishing in the sea and doing, dragging nets along the bottom, all of which they've done. And you can use machine learning to count things and to annotate things. So they can count every tree on Earth every day. It's an interesting environmental movement step. Or in this case, in my neighborhood in Noe Valley up in San Francisco, identify all buildings and roads every day. And of course, this is not just in one area where you're focused. Because it's a machine learning algorithm, this is happening every day for the whole planet. So as we zoom out here, for a moment, it's disorienting as you see the huge, vast, unroaded area of America. And you can see in the red blurs here where the concentration is. Sahara, very little. Europe, incredible concentration in India and China, almost nothing going on in Russia in contrast. And again, imagine that this data is gathered daily. Now, why now? So Planet Labs and the Earth observation companies that sort of I think Planet Labs really led the small sat revolution that we now see all over the place. It was enabled by several things: cheaper access to space, SpaceX and others, ride sharing, what have you, the simulation tools. The first Planet Labs satellite worked the first time. There was a airplane test on the Earth before they flew it, but their first attempt to take a photo was beautiful in the Pacific Northwest forest. I still have a print of that photo. And it really helps to know what you're doing. Commoditized hardware. Everything in the Planet Labs satellite is commercial off the shelf, kind of like, I might say that their hardware is the peace dividend of the cell phone wars. So when Huawei and Apple and you name it, and new competitors are competing on the cell phone side, they're driving down the cost of 6-axis accelerometers, low-cost non-volatile memory, processors, what have you, all the low-power circuitry. Those are the exact same chips that are being used in these satellites. Remember, again, the PhoneSat disembodied, now wrapped around a telescope. That's what Planet Labs is. And the theme in Apple with the iPhone, Tesla with their electric vehicles, SpaceX with their rockets, is that the physical thing is being dematerialized as much as possible. You remove the buttons, you simplify the hardware as much as possible. So every control board in a SpaceX rocket is a similar FPGA system because it's fast enough to do the control systems you need, whether it's stage separation or controlling various things, actuators all over the rocket. Use the same basic building block over and over again and make it a software exercise, of course, for changing and adding value over time. This is true software-defined radios. It just goes on and on. It becomes, again, a software layer. And that's why, by the way, the most important recruiting bottlenecks for many of these companies' growth is on the software side. It also is the case that you can now serve global markets like never before, and you can adopt many of the agile engineering techniques of the software industry in aerospace and something Planet Labs affectionately calls agile aerospace. In other words, trying to ship a new product every few weeks, literally, and driving your team to that is a very different way of thinking than, let's say, the multi-year government contract approach or cost plus kind of contracts where you just spend so much money over such a long period of time and hope after a decade or two that it actually works. Which, by the way, let me go back for a second. That's an important point. If you just use today's hardware, again, imagine that a satellite's capacity to do interesting things will also pivot on its computational power. Can it do pattern recognition in satellite? Can it do image processing in satellite? If you use the latest and greatest off-the-shelf chips today versus something that's flight-proven, rad-hard, 10 years old, a 10-year gap in Moore's law, 2 to the 10th power, is 1,024x. In other words, if you just use today's chips, you will have 1,000x advantage over someone who's locked in the 10-year-old technology. And if they're trying to make their satellite last 20 years, on average, the satellite that's flying is quite ancient. So in fact, when you look at the Mars Curiosity rover, the sky crane, all this incredible technology, it is a 2 megapixel camera because it was a 2004 design freeze that led to that. And all the compute, all the memory capacity is commensurate with what you would expect in a 2 megapixel era. That was the best you could get at the time. Obviously, when it comes to imagers and satellites and the compute and the memory footprint, you wouldn't want 1,000x disadvantage. Again, for free, 1,000x for free if you just use today's chips. That's part of the Planet Labs epiphany. Okay, so what are some new things coming up? I'm super excited about orbital space tourism. On the top are some images of what it looks like, just to remind us, from the Gemini 11 mission, which, as some of you might recall, the Gemini spacecraft connected with an Agena target vehicle and then went higher still, setting new records for how high up humans had been, much higher than just the simple low Earth orbit stuff that had come before. And the Earth looks very different up there. That's where you see Earth streaming by. This is the experience that's almost religious or spiritual for the astronauts who have experienced it. It's the speed. And that speed relates to altitude, of course, but it's not that different, frankly, if you're 17 miles up, 50 miles up, 62 miles up. They all look the same. I hate to tell you. Having flown rockets and seen tons of video footage from 100,000 feet up, it looks just like that. The blackness of space, the thin blue line of the atmosphere, and what you see below, pretty much where you launched from. So unfortunately, all the suborbital tourist stuff coming up, let's say you launch out of the New Mexico spaceport, you'll see a part of New Mexico. That's it for the Earth. So just keep that in mind. Suborbital tourism, it's a hop. You'll see where you came from. Very different from orbital. And I think the excitement for me is orbital, both around the Earth and the Moon, and for some Mars. I'm more of a Moon and Earth person just for how much time I'm willing to commit to this. So that's where my dream is. But I would share that I think the suborbital trips are going to be really underwhelming. Other than some bragging rights initially, it will quickly commoditize and be safe. Otherwise, it's got bigger problems. And once it does that, the bragging rights will be a little bit weird. It'll be like saying, I took a first-class flight on a jet. Yeah, and so did a lot of people. What's the big deal? It's not like getting your astronaut wings back when it was dangerous, back when it was like being a test pilot. This is going to be like you sit in an autonomous vehicle and they take you on a ride, just like flying in an airplane. But that's really what it should be. To democratize access to space and space tourism, you shouldn't have to go through training. You shouldn't have to go through a selection period. And the difference this time around, when it's driven by commercial interests, unlike Apollo, unlike the space shuttle, it's not like you have to go through this life dedication to become an astronaut, like, maybe join the Air Force or dedicate your life to getting a PhD in rendezvous, like Buzz did, the speaker earlier today. You could just be anybody and have earned enough money to take a flight. Now today, I'll admit, it's only for the super rich. Give it 10 years, 20 years max, it'll be like flying an airplane. This is what Elon's end goal is. When it's just fuel and you've reused the entire Starship, the cost to go in orbit around the Earth should be the same as a commercial airline ticket around the Earth. I don't think that has sunk in when people think about tourism. And when will that arrive? And will that be here in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years? I'm personally thinking it's going to be between 5 and 10. The plan is sooner, but I'm betting on that. As long as I'm healthy, I don't have a car accident, and I have enough to afford an airline ticket, I can be an astronaut. That is an amazing vision that I hope will inspire and excite many of you here today. That could be you. Now, the other major business opportunity, perhaps bigger than any I've ever seen in my career, we're just going to start seeing this year and get into full gear next year. And that's, of course, broadband data from space. I've been super excited about this and working on it for quite a while now. And I can't tell you how exciting this is. This is going to bring the next 4 billion people online sooner than most forecasters outside of the space industry have been thinking about. These people will have access to online education. They'll be able to contribute to the global economy like they can't today. So anyone who doesn't have access is missing out on the global economy. And I don't know if there's any historical precedent of 4 billion people or that percentage of the population moving from being not part of the global discussion and the contribution of ideas and economic potential to becoming one. And that has me excited. This may be the biggest boom to the global economy in indirect ways we can't fully appreciate that the world has ever seen. And of course, it's one of the larger business opportunities the world's ever seen as well. When Google was first brainstorming the idea of this before spinning it out, they believed that it was a larger business opportunity than Google's core business of search itself. So in other words, they believe this exceeded any of their other current business units or business lines. They also, I think, maybe wisely thought maybe that's not all under a Google umbrella, but maybe more of an independent third-party provider. So make a long story short, that's where we're heading. And as you know, this will be blanketing the Earth with a series of satellites that are basically, every latitude is treated equally. It's not like one area is capable of service more than another, other than some longitudinal effects. And in the long run, the whole world will be covered, but initially certain latitudes will be covered well. And so that's exciting. I'm looking forward to that starting at the end of this year. I recently tweeted, because I tested the ground station. I can't show you what that looks like quite yet, but the main dream and opportunity here is to make it really simple. You just plug it in and have it generally looking at the sky. And there you go. The thing that makes, by the way, this generation of satellite broadband possible is phased array antenna operating in the Ka and the Ku band. Prior to that, you had to have moving parabolic dishes. Most people think of a communication dish or like a radio telescope as something that has a parabola, and you have to point that at something. Well, with an electrically steerable phased array antenna, you remove all moving parts. And so earlier attempts like Teledesic and others to do these back in the days of parabolas, they penciled out to be just way too expensive. The key technology enabled in an indirect way by Moore's law and advances in power semiconductors and very high speed power semiconductors is making this antenna possible now, which it wasn't 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, and is the key technology linchpin of this whole architecture working. It also helps to have low-cost launch because there's a lot of satellites you have to put up. As you probably know, in the past, when you had a satellite phone, there was a delay because you went to a geosynchronous satellite, something Arthur Clarke predicted, a certain orbit where you're hovering over the fixed place on Earth continuously. You never move. Whenever you fly close to Earth, there's no way to avoid that you're going to be in orbit relative to a ground position. So by being close, you lower latency dramatically, but you are in movement. So you have to have a network. You have to have thousands of satellites up to have continuous coverage, to always have one overhead. And so the ground station will be, handing off from one connection to another continuously, invisibly, of course, and making this product possible. In the nonprofit world, I've been a supporter of B612 for a while now, and we now have enough, thanks to Moore's law, computational capacity to run these enormously complex Monte Carlo simulations for all near-Earth asteroids that could potentially threaten life on Earth. Now, we don't have the trajectory of them all now, but we're about to get them from the LSST, which is coming online in 2021 in Chile. This is this huge wide-angle telescope that's going to survey 600,000 asteroids every single night. And from a few trajectory points, meaning understanding its velocity vector, you can now forecast out longer and longer. And that's computationally bound. So now about 50, in some cases 100 years of forward-looking trajectory, including gravitational slingshots and other things like that. And so what you can see here, red dots are, this is a simulation purposely made to intersect Earth in the distant future, but to sort of see the range of noise and then the probability function. You'll know exactly where it's going to hit and when it's going to hit, if it hits, but ultimately it's a probability. The red dots as a percentage of the total number of dots. And this is a snapshot in time. There's certain green ones that haven't hit Earth yet, and Earth will have moved by the time they are. And the other ones have swung around and have been affected by Earth's gravitational effect by having come just before Earth came in front. So that's why you see this interesting pattern in where the green dots are. Make a long story short, humanity's never had the capacity until now, in the last few years, to actually protect ourselves from all asteroid concerns. And I mean all, except for maybe the ones from outside our solar system, which is a tiny, tiny percentage of the total things that could threaten us. For the ones that are in anything like a near Earth orbit, we can now model that. And all we need to do is gather the data. We used to think we had to launch a satellite in a near Venus orbit looking outward to gather that. We hope the LSST will gather the data we need. And this is a nonprofit that is doing this and could use your support as well. Let me go to the next one. One other group, there's a nonprofit called Open Lunar Foundation I've been involved with since its founding. We actually held the organizing meetings at our office. And the main output of that, which I want to share for you today, is that the cost of a permanent lunar base, so a permanent human settlement on the moon, should be less than $3 billion. Now, that is much less than any prior government-funded study has come up with. And it was basically a simple analysis of bringing a lot of NASA people together, a lot of space people together from both commercial and non-commercial sectors, and say, okay, what is the current cost of launch using today's cost from SpaceX, not some historical cost? And it's pretty amazing. Chris Hadfield, the astronaut, is the chair of that endeavor. And it sort of seems to me much more likely that some business or nonprofit entity will create a permanent settlement elsewhere than a government, which is kind of mind-boggling to think of. But I believe we're in that era where it can be driven by business interests and it can be driven by opportunities, even though we're going to have government programs for sure. And I applaud that. In fact, we may be having a new space race between the US and China when it comes to the moon and Mars. And we'll see, because there's a lot to be said for the opinion the world has of a country based on its space program and its ability to explore the frontiers of the unknown. So let me end with some thoughts from people more wise than me. And each one has an anecdote attached to it. So actually, I'll start with a quote at the bottom here, then I'll read it to you. It's from the National Space Society own pile. But he's quoting Buzz Aldrin. So these are Buzz Aldrin's words in the opening of Pyle's book, Space 2.0. The first era of space exploration culminated with the return of Apollo 17's crew in 1972. We have not transported humans beyond Earth orbit since that time. This is simply not good enough. The promise of Apollo was of one of evergrading expeditions to other worlds and in-depth explorations of them by human beings. Now, maybe that goes without saying, but not everyone in the space community would necessarily agree with Buzz. Some believe that, especially for deep space exploration, it should all be robotic probes. But it's good to think that the Apollo astronauts, many of whom you heard earlier today, are rooting for this future. In fact, I have this photo that you see on the left hanging in my office, and there's a near identical one hanging in SpaceX headquarters down in Hawthorne, where I got and personally solicited Apollo astronauts from each of the missions to give their congratulations or, well, tidings to SpaceX just after SpaceX had docked for the first time with the space station, or birth, to be more precise. And they said amazing things. I'll just read one quote, which I love, because it was Dave Scott, the Apollo 15 commander and formerly Apollo 9 astronaut as well. He wrote, in his own words, this was not with me prompting him, "The first leap of many giant steps to Mars." Now, it's a kind of an interesting twist on Neil Armstrong's one giant leap comment. But most importantly, Mars, onward, wishing SpaceX good wishes for that future. And I even got Gene Cernan, who at times has been a little curmudgeonly on this topic. Neil Armstrong, unfortunately, had passed, but of course I had Buzz Aldrin giving the big bold-faced congratulations and so on. I remember Al Bean was especially effusive, as was Charlie Duke and everyone else that you see here. Another interesting quote. This one from Stephen Hawking in a foreword to a book he wrote, where he wrote this foreword in 2009. "We need to renew our commitment to human spaceflight. Robotic missions are much cheaper and gather important scientific data, but they don't spread the human race into space, which should be our long-term strategy. If one is considering the future of humanity, we have to visit other worlds ourselves." Now, this, of course, echoes poetically what Elon Musk has been saying is the founding vision and mission of SpaceX is to colonize and make humanity a multi-planetary species, starting with Mars. Of course, it goes without saying, it's so invigorating and exciting to know that the two astronauts right now in orbit, the mission's underway. We wish them best of luck in their return in a few weeks back from station. But the going up part went very well, and it ushers a new era of spaceflight, right? America's flying astronauts again into space, thanks to commercial space. And, of course, the NASA collaboration. One last quote, which I love. Actually, two last quotes. One from Arthur C. Clarke, that same book, that same foreword in 2007. "Fortunately, we need not rely solely on governments for expanding humanity's presence beyond the Earth. In that sense, space travel is returning to where it started, with maverick pioneers dreaming of journeys to orbit and beyond. Now, this is kind of interesting because if you look back at Goddard, Werner von Braun, pioneers in the industry, they were motivated by science fiction. It may be the only area of science that had as its predicates the arts, right? Movies and books and films about the possibility of space travel before anyone had actually done it or even knew whether, for example, rockets would work in a vacuum, which was debated in the early days. So as the science fiction intersection with space is relevant in that many of the dreams some of us harbor and motivate us come from these underpinnings in science fiction. Now, Sir Arthur Clarke tragically died just months after writing this and never got to see SpaceX succeed. But in this forward, he basically paints the picture of what has happened since and what will happen in the future. And again, he's an incredible forward-looking seer. So last quote from my favorite space book. I've read many, but I love this one from Andrew Chaikin, Man on the Moon. It's the closing paragraph of the book. The book's about Apollo, of course. Once we are living on the moon and venturing out across the solar system, the fact that we waited so long to resume our explorations will hardly matter. Historians of the historians of the far future may look back on Apollo and the missions that are yet to come as one great age of space exploration. But in my mind's eye, it's a slow dissolve from memory to anticipation, from what has been to what will be, from dream to dream. I literally just got chills and goosebumps. Every time I read this, that has that effect on me. I love that. It's slow dissolve from dream to dream. So let me say thank you. Let me end with this image of Dragon currently at station. Breathtaking image from NASA. And say thank you for the National Space Society for being a believer in this possibility for so many years back when it was more of a crazy idea than it is today. Everything that changes the world for the better, everything that is meaningful and disruptive change, because those are synonymous in my opinion, because if you're not changing something, it's not meaningful. It's like business as usual. Every meaningful change is regarded as crazy in the early days. Before someone shows that it can be done, it is ridiculed by the majority. This is true for simple ideas like Skype or Google or Hotmail in the internet domain. I promise you the majority of investors thought they were dumb ideas. I promise you the majority of the 500 VCs that are currently invested in the space sector thought it was a dumb idea 20 years ago. And for some, as early as 10 years ago. And for some, even 5 years ago. And yet they're still, playing, of course, the herd catch-up game, which we do so well. It's the pioneers, the believers, people like Elon Musk, people like NSS, and the folks that are members of this organization that really forge the future. I am prouder than anything I've done in my professional career to be associated in some small way with this. And I wish you all well as you explore the frontiers of the unknown, push the boundaries of humanity to new frontiers, and make life worth living. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ryutsarek Abramovich, PhD. I'm a researcher, astrobiologist, and science educator at the Dead Sea Narabas Science Center in the Israeli desert. I've also co-founded and chairperson of the Israeli Mars Society, and I'm also a guest lecturer at the International Space University. I'm very happy to be here today. My goal is to find new life forms in the solar system and monitor existing one. For instance, when a human crew is working in isolation on a moon base or a Mars base. It's super, super tough to find life forms, new life forms in the solar system, and I'm happy to be part of this challenge. I co-founded NGOs in Israel in order to promote active participation of the public in our future on Mars, and I hope you're on a space journey too. See ya.
About the magazine, it's being one of the perks, but I mean, what are the other reasons, would you say? The main draws?
No, the NSS is just awesome. The people,
We can't
the
hear
information.
What?
There's so much going on that you just want to be a part of it.
Take the helmets off.
What?
Huh? Do you hear something?
It's just kids.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I don't know.
But so being a part of NSS is life-changing.
Take the helmets off!
What did you say?
It's not clean audio!
Oh, I didn't really think that through. I guess that's probably just one more thing that we'll have to deal with in space, isn't it? Not being able to talk to each
Oh,
other.
your earring getting caught.
Oh well. So, but I don't know, where were we? Oh, Day in Space! Well, we hope that you have enjoyed our broadcast on behalf of the National Space Society. I should like to thank my wonderfully talented and vivacious co-host, Dr. Cyan Proctor, for being part of this venture.
It's been a real pleasure being here, chatting with you, Jeff, and
you.
of course, everybody out there.
And if you have enjoyed this broadcast, you feel it's been enlightening, or you just want to learn more about the world of spaceflight, or as we hope and desire and wish you would want to be part of it, please join the National Space Society. Visit us at nss.org. And I think our viewers would actually enjoy being part of the mission to build a new and better future in space.
Absolutely, I know I have.
Right on. Well, I guess it's time for us to prepare for the mission.
Yep, time to blast off.
Right on. Well, I'll see you up there. I've really been looking forward to this.
What do you mean?
I mean, you know, once we get into orbit and all that.
Have you noticed?
Yeah, it's
I think
fantastic.
you're the backup. You're not going.
What do you mean backup? I got my special NASA jacket and everything.
I'll wave to you from space. See you later, Jeff.
What a letdown. Does the backup crew actually get to do anything?
You get to communicate to me every once in a while.
Oh, well, at least I get to be Capcom. That's something to look forward to.
Let's go.
I tried to know when to leave. She sits in the bedroom and grieves. There's a sequence that starts all again. She can't get up anymore with the pain. The combination of these drugs has left her hopeless and lost. She wants to count the ways, but she can't count again. Tried 1,000 times, slaughtered like gods when the silver shines so hard. I tried to poison my life, always dreaming of the edge of the knife. She always looked backwards and I couldn't sit here for even 10 minutes or more.